Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today. Today, we will take a look at a Socratic dialogue. Today we will be examining the Socratic dialogue of Aeon. This was written by Plato in the 4th century BC. Plato wrote this dialogue, and the two main characters are Socrates and Aeon, after which the dialogue is named Aeon. So Socrates and Aeon. Aeon is a public performer of epic poetry. So Aeon of Ephesus, he's sort of like a public performer and actor. So anyways, this specific dialogue talks about Plato's views on art as a form of divine inspiration, a sort of divine inspiration from God. Most of us today focus on rationalism. Everything is just logic. And we say that logic is everything. This was written in the 4th century BC, so over 2,000 years ago. This work talks about divine inspiration, that artists are actually divinely inspired. So this is another aspect of our consciousness, supposedly. So today in our society, we focus on rationalism. Everything is all just logic, analyzing things. But this tells you that there is another aspect to the human mind. There is intuition, direct knowing, and inspiration, being divinely inspired, so that God speaks through inspired musicians and artists. So that's interesting. And this talks about Plato's views on art as a form of divine madness and divine inspiration, a lot like oracles. Now, something else I would like to say before we get into the dialogue is that this is a perfect example of the Socratic method. Now, what the hell is the Socratic method? The Socratic method is a form of questions. The Socratic method is when you question someone until you get them to contradict themselves. It's like interrogation. The Socratic method is used by lawyers today in law school. You ask leading questions to get someone to trip someone up. Now, Socrates used this to break down people's beliefs and reveal logical fallacies. Aeon is a rhapsodist. He's a public performer of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey and all of that. Now, he is so proud of being a reciter. He says that he does it by knowledge. Socrates basically asks him leading questions to show that the reciter really doesn't have any knowledge. That reading poetry, talking about what someone else is doing, he's just spouting off someone else's work. So basically, Socrates tells him, or he asks him questions till he comes to the conclusion, that he is simply possessed by the poet, so to speak. He is a public performer telling what the poet did. And then Socrates tells him that the poet is simply inspired by God. And Socrates uses the analogy of a magnet, that a magnet attracts iron rings, and the iron rings themselves become magnetic, which attracts other rings. so that a magnet puts its power into metal and it becomes magnetic. And Socrates says that God is the magnet. The poet is simply inspired by God. That the poet has no mind within them. They are divinely inspired. Under this argument, you could say that all music is made by one composer. That all works of art are inspired from God. That there is one artist, one composer, and that is the divine. That our minds are taken out of us. It is a form of divine possession. So if you are a musician, if you are a poet, an artist, a sculptor, a painter, sometimes you'll have a burst of inspiration and you have to paint. You have to compose. Where does this come from? Does it all come from our logical aspect of our mind? Or is there another aspect of the mind that we can be divinely inspired? In a sense, we are inspired from without, from something in the ethers, inspired by God. So, anyways, I've got my book over here. Eon. This is the dialogue. So Socrates asks him leading questions, and he gets him to contradict himself. Socrates says, let me ask you one question. That's how it begins. Now here is where Socrates talks about poetry as a form of divine madness. And here he uses the allegory of the magnet. Socrates says, I do see, my dear Eon, and I'm going to show you what I think that means. Really, as I just said now, this is no art in you to speak well about Homer. No, some divine power is moving you, such as there is in that stone, which Euripides calls the Magnesian, but most people call it the Heraclean stone. This magnet attracts iron rings. And not only that, but puts the same power into the iron rings so that they can do the same as the magnet does. They attract other rings so that sometimes there is a whole long string of these rings hanging together. And all depend for their power on that one stone. So the muse not only inspires people herself, but through these inspired ones, others are inspired and dangle in a string. In fact, all the good poets who make epic poems, they use no art at all, but they are inspired and possessed when they utter all these beautiful poems. So are the good lyric poets. These are not in their right mind when they make their songs, but they are like corybants out of their minds dancing about. So anyway, Socrates goes on talking about poetry and arts being divine inspiration. For a poet is an airy thing, a winged and a holy thing. And he cannot make poetry until he becomes inspired and goes out of his mind. And no mind is left in him. So long as he keeps his senses, no man is able to make poetry and chant oracles. Not by art, then, they make their poetry. Not by art, but by divine dispensation. Therefore, the only poetry that each one can make is what God has pushed him to make. For not by art do they speak these things, but by divine power. Since if an art taught them how to speak well in one kind, they can do it for all the other kinds. Therefore, God takes the mind out of the poets and uses them as his instruments, so that those who chant oracles, seers, diviners, and because he wishes us to know that not those we hear who have no mind in them are those who say such precious things, but God himself is the speaker through the poet. So according to Plato, through his character Socrates, Plato is saying that those who speak well, those who are musicians, those that make really great poetry, write really cool books, that they are divinely inspired. They are simply a tool, an instrument. So anyways, that's basically it. So the Socratic method is a form of debate. And most of the Socratic dialogues of Plato are debates, where Socrates asks leading questions to get people to contradict themselves and to find falsity. So that is the Socratic method. And this dialogue explains Plato's view on art as being divinely inspired, a form of divine madness. And it foreshadows his views on art as explained in the Republic. And in the Phaedrus, another dialogue where Socrates talks about love as a divine madness, he also talks about oracles, diviners, prophets in a sense, and poets as a form of divine madness when they're possessed and out of their minds. So divine inspiration. Today we all focus on our logic. It's all about our logic. Socrates talks about divine inspiration. Sometimes we have bursts of inspiration that seem to come from out there. We have intuition, direct knowing, inspiration, enlightenment. That there is this other aspect to the mind. That everything's not about logic. There is this other faculty. We have divine inspiration. That musicians and artists are inspired by God. And that is Plato and the Socratic dialogue he wrote called Aeon. Thank you for joining me. Once again, this is Taliesin McKnight. Take it easy, y'all. And one more thing. I'd like to ask you a question. What do you think about inspiration? So this is a question for the viewer. Do you believe that there's such a thing as inspiration? Do you believe that there is this other aspect, that sometimes we are inspired? Art and stuff is inspired. So what do you think about this? So that is one question that I would like to leave. And in the comments, I'd like to know what you think. So anyways, thank you for joining me. This is Taliesin McKnight. Take it easy, y'all.